November 1st. So I don't know if nobody saw this. It's right before the election, so nobody cares. Nobody saw this. The Vatican Secretariat of State provides context of Pope Francis's civil union remark. Okay, so I don't know who these guys are that have the job of spinning Francis. But when he retires or dies, because that's pretty much the only way out, the books that they could write about the backroom meetings where all of a sudden everyone's cell phone goes off and all these priests and monks go running across the Vatican grounds into the special room. And it's like, what now? Can you believe this? Oh, no. And in this situation, this took days. And normally it only takes hours. Normally, when the call goes out, the Vatican Secretariat of State, their special shock troops, their SEAL Team 7, they come out with a statement really, really quick because they have to. Not this time. It took a while to cobble something together and to try to do some damage control and say, well, you know, there were these specific situations in Buenos Aires when he was archbishop there, and all he's really saying is that, you know, people who've been together for a long, long time, there should be consideration of, you know, medical decisions and visitation in hospitals and you know, this is really all he's talking about. He's always differentiated between marriage and civil unions, even though we all know the civil union thing. Is there anywhere, I wonder, in the world where the civil union thing was where it stopped? Or is the pretty much universal experience so far is that civil unions is the stopgap point right before Obergefell, basically? But the idea is, all he was really saying is that homosexuals who live as a couple should have these legal abilities to share properties and stuff like that. Well, that's still, you still have to sit back and go, okay, can you imagine a pope from any preceding century that would ever have given consideration to this? And because the honest response is no. And so the only next step to take is to start applying Cardinal Newman's development hypothesis in regards to the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church and start expanding that out to morals and ethics and saying, yeah, that's true. No pope before this century minimally, and really no pope ever would have considered this, but we have to allow the church to develop with culture. And the culture's acceptance of what is still officially considered to be a disordered state, a disordered desire. The culture's acceptance of that disorderedness could use a little bit of order. And all we're suggesting is that. It took a long time to come up with a pretty lame excuse, but they've come up with something. And I'm sure they're probably just waiting for the next explosion and the next thing that will come after that. But again, for the hardliner who wants to continue to believe that the Pope's the infallible vicar of Christ on earth, they're just sitting there going, but he didn't say, I pronounce and define this doctrine. And as long as he doesn't do that, which of course makes infallibility irrelevant because popes almost never do that. But anyway, which reminds me, one last thing before we wrap up. I mentioned on the Theology Matters microblog last week, I think, we are putting the studio together. Rich is over there each day messing with stuff and putting stuff together, and we're working on it. In fact, he's leaving now to go do some more, I'm sure. And that's going to, once we have it functional and we really know how it works, and after we fall on our faces a few times, which will happen, after we have a few technological nightmares and figure out how to avoid those types of things, after we get past the Windows Vista stage, for those of you old enough to appreciate that, then we will be looking at scheduling real debates. And it has been pointed out that there are some Roman Catholic debates on the table, including, interestingly enough, a invitation from Jimmy Akin to debate Sola Scriptura. And Trent Horn mentioned that, and I wrote back, and I didn't see a response to it. If Trent responded to this, I didn't see it. Let's put it that way. But my response was, I would think that the real necessary topic of the day would be, is Pope Francis the infallible vicar of Christ on earth? Don't you think? Why, in light of Pope Francis's interesting statements and the responses even from Roman Catholics to his interesting statements, don't you think that would be the subject that needs to be debated today? Because we've debated Sola Scriptura. I first debated Sola Scriptura 30 years ago, back in August. So Jerry Matitix and I have debated it. Obviously, Patrick Madrid and I have debated Sola Scriptura. Mitchell Pacwa and I have debated Sola Scriptura. And I still think that Mitch Pacwa and my debate on that subject handles the subject just perfectly fine. But it's the other side. I've debated Robert Zingenis and Tim Staples, specifically on papal infallibility. That's a narrower aspect of other side's claim to Sola Scriptura. The Roman Church's claim that the Pope is the visible head of the Church and epistemologically provides them with absolute certainty, which they say cannot be obtained with only Scripture, and that Scripture is not intended to function as being both materially and formally sufficient, but that the Pope is. So, over the past 30 years, Roman Catholic apologists have sort of honed their arguments and discussed what's called the partum partum theory, which was one of the views expressed at the Council of Trent in regards to holy tradition being found partly in Scripture and partly written, partly oral. And then that wasn't how Trent eventually put it. That was in one of the rough drafts, but it was not eventually the words of Trent. And so they have, especially in the last century, attempted to, how shall I say, sharpen their definition of tradition in light of the development hypothesis, Cardinal Newman, And so you've got Yves Congar's work on tradition being something they point to very frequently, and the categories of material and formal sufficiency. And their willingness to say that while Scripture is not meant to provide the sole infallible rule of faith, that implicitly all of Revelation is contained in Scripture. And that's a way of trying to get around the real problem, and that is, if you deny sola scriptura, you in essence are opening up the reality of continuing revelation within the church in the form of this tradition, which then can only be defined by the living magisterium, and therefore you're stuck with Joseph Smith, basically. Obviously in a prelate's hat, but different concept. Anyway, I would think that a Roman Catholic would, at this point in time, want to give a firm and clear defense of the positive claims of their church, and hence a defense of the idea that Pope Francis is the infallible vicar of Christ and is therefore the only true mechanism whereby tradition can be defined. And in fact, the only true interpreter of Scripture, the only true definer of Scripture, the only true definer of tradition, and the only true definer of the meaning of tradition is found in Pope Francis. Because that's what Rome says. You know why that would be doubly useful? Because there are some Eastern Orthodox guys that want to get involved in this, and that would differentiate between the Eastern Orthodox denial of sola scriptura and the Roman Catholic denial of sola scriptura. Because the Orthodox denial has to take a different road. And in one way, the Roman Catholic position is somewhat easier to define. Well, especially in a debate, almost anything Roman Catholic is easier to define because you've got the Western mindset of dogma, decrees, canons and decrees of various councils you can just turn to. Whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's much more the definition of theology via the liturgy, which is not nearly as definable. And that's why, in my opinion, most Eastern Orthodox apologists end up sounding like Roman Catholics without wanting to. When they enter into Western-style debate, there's a fundamental gap between that and Orthodoxy's actual experience, in my opinion anyways. But the point is that would differentiate between the Roman Catholic denial of sola scriptura and the positive claim, because the positive claim of Rome is denied by Eastern Orthodoxy. The positive claim of the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome is denied. And especially when we get into the real issue, which is epistemology. What is theopneustos? What is an actual true word from God?